I don't hear you.
I don't hear her either.
Yeah, we're not getting the audio in. We're just getting the slides now.
Okay, there we are. There we are. When it goes off, it turns off the sound for me too. So I just put it back on. So you should hear me now.
Yes.
Okay, so three most important figures in the early part of the Baroque period, of course, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, Francesco Borromini, and Pietro da Cortona. As you can see on the timeline, Pietro da Cortona is a couple of years older than Francesco Borromini and 1 year older than Bernini. But as an architect, he precedes in style Francesco Borromini because Francesco worked with Bernini for many years before flying off by himself. And so we will see that, in fact, Pietro da Cortona has an influence on the design of Francesco Borromini. The reason why I didn't put him first or second in chronological order is because there was that rivalry between Bernini and Borromini that was more explainable if you want, if you put them one after the other. So this is the reason. Let's look now. Sorry, but for whatever reason. So sorry, but I'm trying to. Okay. The screen doesn't even respond. So Pietro da Cortona was born as Pietro Berrettini in Cortona, Tuscany in 1597. He will come to Rome in 1612 and studies classical antiquity and Renaissance, and we will find that very prominently in his design. In 1623, he becomes part of the Sacchetti household, and then also finds another patron who is the famous Cardinal Barberini, who has been an art protector, a real important patron for also Bernini and Borromini. In 1634, he is elected as director of the Accademia di San Luca. And 1637, and then from 1640 to 47, he's called to Florence by the Medici to decorate many of the big salons of the Pitti Palace. And we'll see that that's going to take a lot of his time and is quite overwhelming. And then he will die in Rome in 1669. One of his first work is the Villa del Pinetto. It's in fact what they call a casino, which means a pleasure house. This was a lodge where the notables would take refuge from the crowded Rome. Unfortunately, all I have is that beautiful engraving to show you the villa because it was destroyed about 50 years after it was built. It's very beautiful villa. You can see very symmetrical, but is borrowing from different other architects as Palladio and others that preceded him. It has that magnificent flight of stairs that lead to the upper casino. And then, of course, coming down from the garden that were very large and highly decorated with sculptures and fountains and so on. You can see that the crown of the casino is decorated with statuary and a kind of a gallery, almost like a balcony. It has some columns that decorate on both sides of the entrance, and then these wings that come around and almost embrace, if you want, the rest of the house. So the reason why it was destroyed is that within 50 years, the Sacchetti and the Barberini were in low esteem towards the rest of the society in Rome. And so the palace, just like much in Rome, became a ruin. And therefore, it was literally raised and made into a large park. When I mentioned Palladio, we have to realize that that architect that lived between 1505 and 1550 had become so prominent, and in great part, not only for the beautiful architecture that he had designed, but also because of the extraordinary 4 books of architecture that had been published in 1570 and had been literally printed and spread all over Europe, particularly England, that absolutely loved the style. And it's going to be, that book is going to be so influential on architecture in the centuries that follow, just because architects would be able to look at the plans and all the explanation by Palladio on how he was intending to do it. And still nowadays in the United States, for example, Palladio is very much alive. Every time you see a bank with a portico with columns and a pediment, this is directly inspired from Palladio. The first commission that he's going to get for a church, it's one of the 3 churches that he will do pretty much in a row. We have the Santi Luca e Martina. The other 2 are Santa Maria della Pace and Santa Maria in Vialata. What we find with Cortona, it is so interesting that he is very much taking the surrounding into account and try to use the facade as a sort of stage that relates in appearance with the state, the space and the location around. So for example, in this case with the San Martina and Luca, it is literally at the edge of the Forum Romano, as you can see in the picture where we have some of the ruins of the temples as well as the Triumphal Arch. So that small church is there. And so Cortona makes that facade that relates directly to the architecture that is exemplified in the Forum Romano. This is considered as one of the most important commissions of his career as far as an architect is concerned. The construction of the church began in the spring of 1635 and was completed by 1664. Let me just make sure that, yeah. Okay. The construction on the facade began in 1635. That always comes last. That little church had existed for many centuries, actually, from the very beginning of Christianity, when Christianity was homologated, if you want, by Constantine. It started by a very small church and then a little bigger, but just rectangular church. And once Cortona is given that commission, he's going to make that small church as a Greek, with a Greek cross plan. And here you can see on that aerial view how small actually the church is, but has a plan that we'll see in a minute that really is showing the nave and the transepts are of the same length, making it that Greek cross plan. And then the facade is quite interesting because we can already perceive what Borromini is going to accentuate, is that different type of facade. It's not all flat. As you can see, it's slightly undulated. It's slightly convex in the middle. So what you have is a 2-level facade with some pediments on both sides, some piers. And then you have 2 columns on either side on the ground floor. And on the second floor, we see only two of the facade, two columns that surround the window that is going to give the light to the nave. And then a very small kind of broken pediment at the top. But it is not flat. So Cortona is starting to play with these surfaces to actually change the play of light and shadow. Here you can see on the plan on the left, the fact that the church has that Greek cross design. And then in the interior, we have more or less the replication of the entrance, though deeper, also surrounded by a column with Ionic scrolls. What is interesting is that in the midst of the construction, the funds dwindled, which happened quite regularly, by the way, thus putting a halt to the construction. But this gave Cortona a chance to build himself a funerary chapel in that little church. And this is where he's actually buried. But what happens is that in the midst of the construction, the relics of Santa Martina and other Christian martyrs were unearthed. And that resulted in a renewed interest by the Pope Urban VIII and by population as a whole. And so the funds came back flowing and he was able to finish the church. Here is the dome with the ribs, of course, that are part of that support system. Windows decorated with small pediments. And then we have the lantern that provides the light to the dome. And then here in the inside, we can already see again the fact that Cortona is, despite the fact he's a painter, he is not intending that dome to be painted, but rather use modules that are diminishing in size towards the center of the dome, accentuating the height of it by the perspective. The other church that he's going to be given commission for is Santa Maria della Pace. Here you see that elevation. He was only hired to build the facade. So the church was in existence, but what the Pope wanted was a facade that integrated itself well in the piazza in front of the existing church, because it was a very small square on which it was, but by the harmony that Cortona is going to bring in, by bringing a very notable narthex, if you want, at the front. It's a kind of a semicircular entrance. He's giving a totally different feel to the church. This is a shift in his design, and where he's playing with concave and convex. As you can see, the convex at the front, but then we have the two wings that are concave and give that great sense of juxtaposition of two different, I can say, elements of design. I'm sorry, but I didn't sleep too much last night. It is inspired by Bramante's Tempietto, so Bramante being one of the other great architects of the Renaissance. Here is the facade and the plan. So you can see the square where the church is very small, and this makes the entrance very prominent but very harmonious compared to the rest. And then we have these wings, if you want, that come and hold, if you want, the rest of the square, kind of embrace the square. And we see also the introduction of a pediment on the top, which is going to be one of his new motifs. In Santa Maria in Via Lata, It's a little church that stands next to the Palazzo Doria Pamphili. There was an old church, but the facade was rebuilt by Cortona for Pope Alexander VII. That actually somewhere along the facade shows its coat of arms with the 6 mountains and the star. Nowadays, it's kind of squeezed into a small street, as you can see there. So very difficult to get a better view of the church because of the wall, the opposite walls. But again, there the Pope asked Cortona to apply his sensitivity to the relation between the monument and its surrounding site. So as it is in a small street, what he does is that he decorates the entrance with the columns, which was a normal thing, and then piers at on the side to frame the whole thing. But he pushes back the entrance of the church and giving it almost a sense of a stage. Same thing on the upper floor, where you have a large niche that again plays with the sun and the shadow, the light and the shadow. So always playing with the verticality, but then it's separated by that horizontal line that's going to balance the two. And then the bell tower that unfortunately you can barely see because of the narrow street. In his paintings, because Cortona is an architect, but he's known mostly for his paintings, he's going to be quite influenced by Cesare Ripa and the Econology. Cesare Ripa was an interesting little fellow that was born in Perugia around 1555 and died around 1622 in Rome. It's not much known about him, except that he was qualified as an aesthetician who was working for the Anton Maria Salviati, one of the big families in Rome at the time, as a cook and butler of all things. After the death of the cardinal, Ripa worked for his relatives. And during his spare times, he was able to publish a very successful book. The title is there, Econology, ovvero descrizione delle immagini universali cavate dall'antichità et da altri luoghi. So it's in fact a book that is a very standard book in the sense it goes by alphabetical order, but gives a sense of a standard illustration for abstract ideas. It's a kind of an emblem book, if you want. He was knighted for publishing that book because it was so successful. It's going to be translated in many languages, spread all over Europe, and later to the United States. Is, by the way, still in print. It will be of great influence on Cortona, on Van Mieris, Vermeer, Quellinus at the Town Hall in Amsterdam, for example, George Winkelmann, and many others. And I'm going to show you a few examples of how this worked. So he would come on allegories, as I say, on rather abstract ideas such as dignity or divine wisdom, and define, and this is based on many other reading he did, define how to represent these values, if you want, so that people could recognize them. So when you talk about dignità or dignity, it was shown as a woman carrying a heavy load. And so when people would see that, say, okay, it wasn't written dignità, but they knew that because it was represented that way, it was dignità. And I've shown you before with Borromini, the allegory on divine wisdom. This is again one of these representation by Cesare Ripa. showing a female figure that is in glory. It has that halo of light around the head, and who is carrying in one hand the Holy Spirit, that dove of literally intellectual influence. And then in the other, she's holding a large book with 7 seals and a little lamb on top of it. And so they knew that Sapientiae Divine, the divine wisdom, would be represented that way, and you knew who it was. And this is, of course, for the elite. The little people generally didn't know that. It's the Econology by Ripa is not the only book with emblems. It's something, it's really a fashion in the end of the 16th century and then the 17th century, where you find books all over Europe in French or in Flemish or in English that show some representation. So for example, the one on the left, Un homme hardi point ne craint les menaces. So how can I say, somebody, a guy that is no fear person, doesn't fear threats. And so you see that a man holding a big mask goes against a lion without fear. And so typically also at the bottom of the illustration, you had a little poem that was related to that idea. Same thing on the right with the Book of Emblems. It is here, over all the stars doth reign, that undue wisdom can attain. So again, always these type of things. So you represent that man on top of the earth and people trying to collect some of the ashes of the book that he's holding. And these can be seen in some of the paintings by the kind of figure that he's using. Not related to that context, we have here one of the rare works on canvas by Pietro da Cortona, The Rape of the Sabine Women, though we find a lot of references to sculptures of the time. We've talked with Bernini in his early works with the serpentine shape of some of his early works that were very mannerist, particularly in Florence. And we find 2 figures that are framing the rape of the Sabine woman. The story, of course, being that Rome was populated with tribe early on, and the only way to renew the bloodline was to go and kidnap some women from another tribe, so you wouldn't have overbreeding. And so this is what you see here, where the Sabine women are taken by the enemy tribe. And they're going to be taken home and then become the wives of many of the warriors, and finally get used to their condition, have children, and so on. And by the time their brothers come back to try to get them back home, they are torn between the family and their spouse and their children. So this is always a very interesting subject. Now, I mentioned many times the Palazzo Barberini. Palazzo Barberini was one of the largest palaces in Rome that had been purchased in 1625 by the Barberini family from the Sforza family, where they had bought not only the palace, but also a lot of the land around, quite large. And as you can see at the bottom, the title shows that in fact 3 main architects worked on that palace: Maderno, who is responsible for the facade of St. Peter, Bernini, and Borromini. And they all had their hand at it, because architecture takes a long time. So you start with something, but then suddenly you called for something else. And often they would finish their part and then leave the job so that somebody else would do it. So Bernini succeeded Carlo Maderno in 1629. And it is him who is going to create the central salon that is going to be the center piece of that palace. So just to give you an idea, here you can see the Palazzo Barberini is here, but look at the extensive ground that was around, with not only leisure gardens, but also medicinal and vegetable gardens all around. They had to sustain the court. So the central body of the palace that is kind of retrieved compared to the wings, if you want, was built actually the first two floors, so the ground floor and the second floor by Bernini, and then finished by Borromini on the top. That changes the frame of the upper window to give you the trompe-l'oeil perspective. So this is that kind of a false perspective that suggests an extra depth that actually doesn't really exist. The gardens were also at the level of that floor, and so was couldn't be seen by the people around. You really had to be at the level of the palace in the background to see the garden. On both sides, you have a flight of stairs. So here and here you have flight of stairs that were actually designed, one by Bernini, as you can see there. It's called the Bernini stairs that leads to the Piano Nobile. So that's the one that goes from the ground floor, Piano Nobile being what we call the second floor. And then the competition between Bernini and Borromini. Here's Borromini with that kind of helicoidal staircase. But our great interest is the decoration of the Grand Salon. And the Grand Salon was 2 stories high. So you had that extremely large room with high perspective, so 2-story high. And this is what Cortona is called to decorate, with the fresco of the Allegory of Divine Providence and Barberini Power. This is going to become a very influential fresco, not copied literally, but the style is going to be copied by many other painters. And we'll see them in the coming weeks. So what we see there is a celebration of the spiritual and temporal glories of the Barberini. He actually began in 1633, and then he interrupted the work in 37 to go to Florence to decorate part of the Pitti Palace, and then came back to finish it in 39. So this is what we can really call a triumph of illusionism, where the ceiling seems to be opening to the sky in the very center. You can see the sky in the background. But what is emphasizing that elevation is the fact that he presents the figures, what is called di sotto in su, which means we see them from down below flying up towards the heaven. And this really makes that ceiling look like incredibly high when it actually is flat. Here it's to be compared, for example, with the very beginning of the 17th century in the Farnese Gallery by Annibale Carracci, where you can see there we have a real semi how can I say, round top, if you want, a barrel, kind of a barrel ceiling, but where the figures created as a narrative for us to look at. So it's just like having a canvas, painting on canvas that is applied to the ceiling. Whereas, as you can see on the other side, we have that incredible energy with Cortona, with the figures flying up just under our eyes. Here's an idea of the figures. And again, this is where the Cesare Ripa enters into consideration, where we have the Divine Providence here, very central to the whole composition. But that follows again the standard of Cesare Ripa. So it has some paraphernalia that are typical to it. We have immortality shown with a crown, charity here, with the cross, hope and religion, faith. So all these, and then we have also some allegories of planets like Saturn, the fates, the divine assistance, and so on. And all this is based very much on Cesare Ripa. Here's a detail of the Divine Providence surrounded, as you can see, by, she's actually floating on clouds and surrounded by gods and goddesses. What is interesting is this is, of course, this belonged to a cardinal, and so it was supposed to be a totally religious painting. But the way they introduced the idea of the Borromini is by their coat of arms, which were bees. And so we see that whole fresco that is speckled with bees everywhere, which shows that presence of the family everywhere. And of course, if you remember when Bernini builds the baldacchino in St. Peter, it's the same. There are little bees everywhere on the columns to remember, to just make sure people know that the Borromini family was the one that commissioned it. At this time, I want to talk about quite a special figure. I'm talking about Christina of Sweden. She is a figure that is not as known as she was at that time. She was a member of the House of Bassa and had become Queen of Sweden in 1632. They didn't have the Sally Claw that existed in many other countries in Europe, so women could become queen. She ruled the Swedish Empire at age 18 in 1644, and then announced at that time that she had decided not to marry. She was absolutely disgusted by the idea of marriage, and instead wanted her first cousin Charles to be the heir to the throne. In 1650, she was crowned, and then she was known to be an incredibly hard worker. She slept 3 or 4 hours a night, but was one of the most learned women in Europe at that time. And she literally became ill in 1652. And all kinds of doctors were brought in. Just about that subject, it's really interesting. I know that most of you are familiar with the philosopher Descartes. And Descartes, who was French, had to flee France and exile himself voluntarily to the Netherlands because of some of his revolutionary ideas. It was, of course, he's known for, I think, therefore I am. So that's Descartes. His ideas were known all over Europe, and the Queen was quite interested in what he was saying and convinced him to move from the Netherlands to Sweden. Now, we have to realize that Descartes wasn't of prime use at that time and was used to a rather comfortable way of life. He was getting up around 10 o'clock in the morning, had the slow morning, and then in the afternoon would receive all people that were visiting him and questioning him. When he moved to Sweden, he didn't realize what he was getting into. In fact, first, the weather was much colder. And on top of that, the Queen requested to meet with him a few days a week at 5 o'clock in the morning to talk to him. And of course, Descartes was completely overwhelmed by that kind of schedule, and finally contracted pneumonia and died 2 months later. He couldn't face the Queen. Actually, the Queen didn't like him very much. And so I don't think she cried when he died, but this is the story, interesting story of poor Descartes. In 1652, after, as I mentioned, that illness that was due to mostly overworking, one French doctor that came tried to familiarize her with some texts that were showing that her way of life wasn't healthy. And she listened to him, and literally within a few weeks went from a Stoic way of life to an Epicurean way of life, where she completely changed her ways, started enjoying life, slept a little more, and ate more too. 2 years later, she abdicated in favor of her cousin Carl Gustav, and then started moving to Italy. On her way to Italy, she stopped in many of the large properties of the German princes, where she wouldn't be received for too long, because she was going down to Italy with a minimum of 255 people and 247 horses. That's quite a bit of a retinue to maintain when she invites herself in one of the castles. While going through Brussels, she is convinced by the governor to convert to Catholicism. And she does, but keeps it a secret because she knows that the Swedes are going to see that very bad, as they are Protestant, and might take all her revenues, withhold her revenues because of it. And indeed, 2 years later, when finally the word goes out that she has converted, the Swedes decide to confiscate all her revenues. She is also interested in meeting the young king, French king, and goes to France. She's given the occupation of a castle while she's there, and decides that one of her closest advisor, Monadelsky, who is Italian, an Italian noble, was betraying her, and literally has him put to death. And this is going to change very much the way the Italian, the way they see her, because they really were very proud that she had been to Italy before, they had a queen, a former queen living there. So when she goes back to Italy, she's not welcome as well as before. She goes back to Rome in 58 and stays at the Palazzo Rospigliosi, who was owned by Mazarin, who was the French minister. In 59, she moves to Palazzo Riario, where she's going to live for the rest of her life. 3 times she's going to go to Sweden when her cousin dies, and then his successor leaves back to France and tries to go back on the throne, but the Swedes are not convinced, and so she has to go back to Rome. The reason why I talk, The reason why I'm talking so much about her, she was an incredible protector of the arts and was using her influence, if you want, next to artists so that she could have direct access to them. So she knew Bernini extremely well, knew the Pope, who was kind of ambiguous about her because she was such a different kind of person. And she was known also to speak her mind whenever something was happening, so much so that when in 1689, she dies in the Palazzo Corsini, which is the same, by the way, as the Riario, she sends the Pope a message before dying, asking if he could forgive her insult, because she disagreed with the way the Pope was treating some people. And so she will die in the 19th of April, 1689. She was fond of books, manuscript, paintings, and sculptures, but also with her interest in religion, philosophy, mathematics, and alchemy. She attracted a lot of scientists to Stockholm and later on to her court in Italy or wherever she was. Here is just a picture of the Palazzo Corsini, which was her last residence. You can see it here in the middle, not too far from the Vatican, which is just over there, and has been renovated and enlarged slightly later on, but this is still in existence in Rome. Why did I talk to you about the Queen? It's because she really had quite, she marked, if you want, her presence in Rome with a stamp. And this is, for example, an example. Here you can see the Palazzo Borromini that we talked about prior to Christina, and show the celebrations that were given in her honor along the Palazzo in 56. And so they built all around the facade and around the gardens these tribunes and balconies. And of course, these were the one where the queen would be and the Barberini family. And they would enjoy that incredible spectacles of knights, riders, and all kind of other things, all the way, some carts that you can see there with extravagant costume. You can also imagine the food and the drinks that were offered at that time, just in the honor of Christina of Sweden. At this time, I'm going to take a little break. And if you want, you can ask me some question, and then we'll go on with the Pitti Palace. Any questions on what we've seen up to now? The extravagant Christina?
Oh, I was curious about the when you were talking about the Santi Martini and Luca, and you said that they found relics buried under the church. Why would they bury their relics? Wasn't that something that was always on display?
No. It depends how big they were. And so they would probably, in a very early church, have that kind of a crypt in which they would bury some of the saints and martyrs, because that was so close to the time where they were killed.
But so then the crypt was lost to memory. Nobody knew.
Oh yes. Oh yeah, that happened regularly. And
really?
This was not, yes, because at that time in very early Rome, we talk about probably a church that was built around 400 or 500. It was a very small church, and so they didn't have at that time a lot of means for these type of churches. They probably had just a little casket then put in, because it was probably the whole remains of the saint. Then they wouldn't have it displayed, if you want. Relics, we know relics because it's the finger of something, the hair of that, and so on. But in this case, it probably was the full remain of the saint and others.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So I really encourage you to try to know more about Christina of Sweden, because she's really an interesting figure and was very influential in that time. And I'm surprised how, in fact, little we hear about her.
Yeah. And so, so who were her friends? Who were the people that that gave her this sort of mini enlightenment, so to speak? She was had a change of heart. That
no, she was always very, very interested in philosophy, literature, science, and so on. That was her forte since she was able to understand it. So she would attract people like Descartes or other German scientists. She probably spoke many languages. would bring them at the court. And then when she moved down to Italy, wherever she was, probably one of the first things she would do is say, oh, who is important here? Who could I know and meet that would interest me? And when she was in Rome, as I say, she became very, I mean, she would go and visit Bernini in his studio regularly, and knew the whole intelligentsia of Rome at that time.
But she didn't really want to be queen. She was only queen for about 10 years, huh?
Yeah, she wasn't too interested in that. The interesting thing too is, as we say, she was absolutely disgusted by the idea of marriage. So people talk a lot about her sexuality, and they are opposed vision about that, if you are. So, but it looks like she had very deep friendships, and okay, up to where did they go, we don't know. But she was also known to have women that she was very fond of. But she wasn't, no, because she was, I think, too interested in all the sciences and so on to be really a queen. She did some bad moves by, for example, she had access to copper and started minting lots of coins of copper as currency, and almost crashed the treasury because of it. So she wasn't too good at leading.
Why would the copper be a bad thing?
Because it wasn't representing the value of what it was supposed to be. Oh. And if you produce too much, if it's not a reflection of what you have in the treasury, then you have an inflation. Oh, it's like if you
like printing dollars, like printing
exactly,
dollars.
Exactly. Same thing. So, but she's a fascinating figure. So I would encourage you to look into her.
Yeah, she is.
Okay, so if you have your coffee, if you stretch your legs a little bit, we're going to go on. So I'm going to mute you to make sure. And then we'll talk at the end. Okay, so one of the most marking decoration beside the Barberini Palace by Cortona is the enormous Pitti Palace. Pitti Palace that was constructed in 1458 by the Florentine banker Luca Pitti, who was one of the main supporters of and friend of Cosimo de' Medici, and was later on then bought by the Medici and occupied by it. The architect was Luca Fancelli, not very known. And what we can notice, and I know that was my impression when I came there, is a kind of a forbidding building, because the rusticated stone that the palace is made of make it look more like a stronghold than a refined palace that we discover once we get in. So once you get in, there are many salons in the Pitti Palace. Sorry, I come back. There we are. And one of the smallest one is the Sala della Stufa. Sorry, I'm missing an S there. That was built by Cortona, but then was decorated by I don't know, I see in there. No, it's not Cortona. I see the S has moved from one place to the other. So by Cortona, and is decorated with different ages that are inspired by Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid, part of the Metamorphoses. And it's the myth of 4 ages. And so each of the panels describes some ages, and we're going to go against the chronological order and look starting with the Golden Age and go down back to the past. So the Age of Gold, where Ovid is emphasizing justice and peace, that defined that golden age. He adds that in that age, men did not yet know the art of navigation and therefore did not explore the larger world. Gold also, in this case, refers to the marriage of the Grand Duke Ferdinand I and Vittoria della Rovere. The della Rovere family, for your information, is the one from which Julius II, the Pope Julius II, will come. The marriage was contracted in 1624 and then consummated in 1637. So this thing that you see, it's Nozze de Dei, which means the marriage of the gods, representing Ferdinand and Victoria. What you find is a pair of turtle dove. Trying to see where they are. And the turtle dove, of course, fidelity in marriage. The young woman crowning the young man. So it's Victoria. Of course, Victoria being the crown and is also surrounded by the oak branches, which was part of the coat of arms of the Della Rovere. So you have here the young Victoria crowning her husband, but she's surrounded by all these oak leaves. The line that we see in the center represents the Marzocco of Florence. So that was one of the big emblems of Florence. And what you see is one of the fates cuts the thread of the Rovere family, as Victoria is the last heir of the Rovere family. The man on the right represents the Arno River. And so what the conclusion of that representation is the marriage is bringing back the golden age to Tuscany. So here is one of the preparation drawings by Cortona for that fresco. And you can see the technique that they were using. So they would prepare a work that is much smaller in scale compared to the fresco itself. And then they would make it a grid. And then the assistant and Cortona could look at each of the little square and apply it on the wall and enlarge it to the scale of the wall. The age of silver, this is justice and peace. Sorry, not correct. Silver, Jupiter introduces the season, and then men consequentially, learn the art of architecture and agriculture. So each age brings some new knowledge. The age of bronze, again, according to Ovid, men were prone to warfare, but not impiety. So they still worship the gods and offer gifts to the gods, and but they are very prone to warfare. And then the age of iron, that's the first age, of course, if we look at chronologically, where men demarcate nations with boundary. They learn the arts of navigation and mining. They are warlike, greedy, and impious. Truth, modesty, and loyalty are nowhere to be found. So we find a very barbarian type of age. So that's one of the smallest salons, by the way, of the Pitti Palace. But then he's going to decorate in the second stay in Florence, which is covers a few years, some of the larger salons where, of course, all the paintings are displayed, the great collection that was amassed by the Medici and by their successors. In this case, we have the Sala di Venere, the Hall of Venus. In fact, each of the salons take the name of one of the planets and the deities associated with it. So here we have a large fresco on the ceiling that we'll see in a minute, as well as 8 lunettes that you can see, the semicircular painting that surround literally the whole work. But it's also, each of these lunettes are framed with an incredible amount of stucco, 3-dimensional stuccos and medaillons and so on, that were all designed by Cortona. Portraits of the Medici family and so on. So here is the ceiling that shows the useful hero is torn from the arms of Venus by Apollo. So there's the useful hero is probably was very attractive to Venus. And of course, we know that Mars is very jealous, and but Apollo is very jealous, sorry, and is going to take away that young man. Here you can see the scene. And it's again with that same type of perspective that we saw in the Barberini Palace, so Di Sotto in Su. And examples of the lunettes that depict some example from antiquity that illustrate the successes that can be gained through virtue and self-denial. This one depicts Augustus. The other one, Antiochus. Always the idea of refusing the advances of pretty women, virtue. The next salon is the view of the Sala di Saturno, so the Salon of Saturn. As you can see, I'm sure you can recognize paintings by Raphael, by Titian, by Flemish painters, Rubens, etc. Again, same idea. It has a big fresco at the top, all kind of lunettes around, and then a heavy stucco work. Now, of course, Cortona had a large workshop, and most of the stucco which was designed by him would be then materialized by other artists. So you can see the very top, again, a fresco that explains the role of Saturn, and then all kind of marginal stories all around. In the Sala di Giove, the Hall of Jupiter, this is considered the most magnificent of all of them. Of course, Jupiter being the main god of the Greek, I mean, in that case, not Greek, but Roman iconography there. And we find that the ceiling again echoes the theme that portrays Jupiter about to crown the young prince being Ferdinand. Here you can see incredible work, stucco work with all kind of caryatids and flying people and medaillons and so on. And here is a detail where you can see Jupiter with the crown, who is going to crown the young hero. And of course, the victorious hero is Ferdinand of Medici. Another room, the Sala di Apollo, same thing. And I was mentioning before, is when you go to the Palazzo Pitti, it's very difficult to even look at the ceiling because you're surrounded by incredible paintings And it's distracting a little bit when you look up or you look down, and difficult to look at both. And here is the central fresco showing Galileo links the Medici stars to Jupiter. And again, some portraits that surround the whole Rome. Portraits, no, but sorry, narratives that surround the whole Rome. Including Theodosius that devotes himself to learning, and Alexander devotes himself to learning. The idea with Apollo is always the idea of learning. In the Sala di Marte, the hall of Mars, we have again, we now have just a very large ceiling with frescoes, but no more smaller paintings that surround the room. And here we see the hero's victory at sea and the allegory of peace. So it shows naval and land battles. And by the way, in the very middle here, we see the Medici coat of arms with the arrangement of spheres in an oval prominently displayed. And these spheres are most probably oranges because this was part of the coat of arms of the Medici and the origin of the name. Beside the enormous work that he did in the Palazzo Pitti, he also decorated some galleries in the Palazzo Pamphili, from which the Pope Innocent X was coming. So every time the Pope was elected, the family of the Pope would become very prominent and would build palaces or buy palaces and then redecorate them. So in this case, that palace that is on the Piazza Navona, we can see San Agnese to the right, and the Fontana del Moro just in front, is now the embassy of Brazilian embassy in Italy. So what Cortona did is the decoration of that slightly barrel ceiling in the what is called the Galleria Pamphili, and giving it the narrative of the legend of Aeneas. Aeneas, of course, the hero from Troy, but is also interesting in part of the history of Rome at the time of Augustus. Augustus wanted the founders of Rome to be linked to gods. And so Ovid really made up literally that whole story where Aeneas leaving Troy when it was on fire with his old father and his Anchises and his young son Ascanius came all the way to Rome and then founded Rome. Now, Aeneas was the son of Venus, and this way, the Rome and all the emperors that led Rome were linked directly to the goddess Venus. And this is one way of legitimizing oneself. And this was quite a fashion during the whole Middle Age and the Renaissance, where families were trying to connect themselves to affiliation all the way back to gods. And here is an extraordinary ceiling there where what you see as sculptures there are no sculptures, they're just painting. So the stucco is very minimal in these ceilings compared to what we saw at the Palazzo Pitti. And again, this is going to be of great influence all over Europe, where palaces in Germany, in England, in France, and so on, Versailles included, are going to start decorating the ceilings with frescoes. And here we can see Aeneas at the prow of his vessel, landing of the Trojan at the mouth of Tiberias, the Tiber River. He was also asked to, coming back to the architecture, to decorate inside, no, actually shouldn't say architecture, but painting too. He's going to be asked to decorate the inside of Santa Maria in Vallicella, decorate not only the dome, but also the semicircular apse. And the Santa Maria in Vallicella, also called the Chiesa Nuova, is one of the principal church of oratorians. So Philippe Néri, the whole idea of that order being to be affiliated very closely to music and chants during their services, or even just with meetings. And inside the church, we can see in the dome the Trinity in glory, and then in the apse, the Assumption of the Virgin. Here's the Trinity in glory with the prophets, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel, and Isaiah, in the pendentives that support the dome. With, of course, the Holy Trinity and the Holy Spirit in the very center. And the Assumption of the Virgin in the apse shows the Virgin elevated at the end of her life, elevated to the heavens. He is far less known for his portable paintings, the canvases and so on. And frankly, when you see the virtuosity of his frescoes, when you see a painting like this one, which is altogether very good, disappears next to his fresco cycle. So this is definitely the fresco that are going to make his name very famous and carry his fame all over, all along the centuries. So we will see that in the next presentation, there is a reaction against the extravagance of many of these ceilings. And we find that some of his the other painters are going to emphasize a simplicity compared to the elaboration of his work. And that's what we'll see on March the 15th. So let me stop the recording.